Susan. Thank you. They're giving themselves a gift this Saturday. Not giving anything up, right? Okay, I have a very short presentation here on the issue of teaching about religion, and particularly teaching about scriptures. So I want to just kind of go over briefly the First Amendment Center guidelines. Many of you are aware of them already. They have a long history going back to the 1950s with theologians, when you didn't talk about religion at all in the schools, or you had schools that actually might be called sacred schools, where it was perfectly normal to expect students to go along with particular prayer. There used to be, in fact, Bible wars in the 19th century about which version of the Bible would be used in schools. So we've come a long way, and during the 1980s and up until the present, we're functioning in public schools under a set of guidelines based on Supreme Court cases, and also based on consensus documents among a wide range of groups. Among the resources that you will find under resources for past workshops at ccas.georgetown.edu/outreach, those links are available also in the bookmark. I put the entire document called Finding Common Ground, which is the history of teaching about religion and the issues of accommodation as well for students of religious persuasions. So you'll be able to find that whole entire document, and I'll just be dealing with sections of it. A second document that is there in full is the American Academy of Religion's K-12 Guide. And the First Amendment Center, which is now the Religious Freedom Center, in the museum, where any of you were here from the World Religions Institute last summer. We spent a lovely first day there. They work together and are currently actually working with the National Council for Social Studies to create an appendix to the C3 Common Core on teaching about religion. So those are the things that are available. The main thing here is that in teaching about religion in every way, these are the folks who have your back. Because many times you're between a rock and a hard place, parents who don't know, and believe it or not, administrators who sometimes don't know, and many times school board members who really don't know. So, and yet you're required to do it, and you have the freedom, ability to do it. And so I'm just going to go over a few particulars here, and most importantly on teaching using scripture in the classroom. So the First Amendment Center guidelines are really quite simple. The school's approach to religion is academic, not devotional. The school strives for student awareness, but does not press for student acceptance of any religion. The school sponsors study about religion, and that's really the key word, not the practice of religion, including simulation, not simulating the practice of religion. The school may expose students to a diversity of religious views, but may not impose any particular view. The school educates about all religions. It does not promote or denigrate religion. And that denigration can often include outrageously incorrect things. So it's a question of being well-trained and well-informed. The school informs students about various beliefs. It does not seek to conform students to any particular belief or any belief at all. Among the guidelines or the implications of these guidelines are, of course, educating but not promoting or denigrating, which requires accuracy and using the best academic sources you have available. Natural inclusion, which most of the time is what's found in the humanities and social studies, certainly in art history, as we'll find out today. Fairness, accuracy, and balance is part of the requirement of not denigrating. Portraying beliefs, and this is really the key here, portraying beliefs and practices as their adherents understand them. We're talking here about the story of stories told. And we have to use the best sources we can, including primary sources, of which scripture is certainly one. Teaching is open-ended and seeks to understand, and the teacher states no religious or irreligious views. I don't want to get into a big discussion about that, but it doesn't refer to whether you're allowed to say, as a teacher, what your particular faith is. Some do, some don't. Teachers who teach in public schools, of course, are acting as agents of the state, and so they are not to do anything that kind of would inhabit that sort of thing. But some teachers who teach world religions or any course at all will choose to state it or not to state it. So respect for differences. Religious truth claims may not be made or denied, but the way they are stated and related is using words of attribution to avoid personal judgments. Muslims believe that, for example, or better than that even, according to these documents, or according to scholars, or so and so. But mainly that is the sort of wall of separation, is these phrases of attribution. And if you have to repeat them 10 times in a sentence and be, redundant, that's fine. But the main thing is that otherwise something stating what people believe can seem like a truth claim unless those words of attribution are inserted. So now the good part. The AAR Guide, American Academy of Religion Guide, discusses a religiously literate person and what their attributes would be, and at the same time states the reason for their creating this guide is that religious illiteracy is fairly widespread. So a basic understanding of the history, and you see me underlined and bolded central texts where they exist, because not all religions have them. Beliefs, practices, and contemporary manifestations of the world's religious traditions and religious expressions, in particular social, historical, and cultural contexts. And that's what also this exhibit is all about in terms of placing the Quran in its artistic and historical context. The ability also to discern and explore the religious dimensions of political, social, and cultural expressions across time and place. So there are four sort of approaches to religion that the AAR Guide talks about: historical, literary, traditions-based, and cultural studies. You'll find I'm not going to go into those at length, but they are there in the early parts of the document which you have access to. Within these approaches, 3 premises about religion should be embodied. Religions are internally diverse. Religions are dynamic. In other words, they change over time. And religions are embedded in culture. I'm going to put this PowerPoint up. I won't spend time going to this resource, but there are 2 that I just want to highlight that really do help you get into the use of scriptures and art objects as well in your classroom. One of them is the Berkeley Center section on traditions, themes, and they have quite a collection of scripture tied to themes like what the scriptures in each of the 5 major faith traditions have, with illness and health, wealth and poverty, the religious other, and so on. So it's quite a remarkable resource. The second one I want to show you is the Akland Art Museum 5 Faiths project, which is a little bit more geared toward middle school, but also can be used in early high school, where they have keyed a number of dialogues and basic descriptions of the world religions, the 5 major faiths, and then they have discussions and works around their the art objects in the collection. So, of course, there's a lot of controversy around the use of and student exposure to religious texts in the classroom, whether the Bible or other scriptures. This has been going on for a long time. That's what the guidelines are basically for. Lately, the Quran has been singled out partly as a function of Islamophobia. There is fear, or ginned up fear in some cases, that mere exposure and learning about equals proselytizing. Before that, there were U.S. conflicts over which Bible, as I mentioned. But the courts have invalidated both the sacred school, where students are exposed to, as sort of captive audience, exposed to prayer in school, or a particular prayer in school, in contrast to the idea that students, however, can request to have prayer groups and prayer sessions and rooms, but it has to be students only. Teachers cannot spearhead this, parents cannot spearhead this, principals cannot spearhead this, but students may request it, and they are allowed to have these accommodations, and that they should be equally applied to all the religions that are represented there. So the naked school has similarly been discredited in court cases. The idea that religion has no place, discussion of religion, or the way they put it colloquially, God's been kicked out of the classroom. So basically the key to this is teaching about religion in an academically sound, fair, and balanced manner is the solution. And ignoring and misusing important primary sources of religious traditions robs students of an important aspect of religious literacy. So public schools, and I might add also that these guidelines are pretty good for using in private schools as well, because they basically set out the academic study of religion. Rather than studying another religion, how come they're wrong sort of thing, it's really a very even-handed framework. So already it's firmly in the core curriculum, and there are a number of courses in world religions, elective courses in world religions in a number of public schools, and of course many private schools. And because religion plays a significant role in history and society, study about religion is essential to understanding both the nation and the world. Of course, it also promotes cross-cultural understanding in our diverse society. I'm going to conclude with just a very couple of points. Learning about the history of the scripture and its role, the role of the sacred text in history are appropriate topics in a variety of courses in the humanities: literature, art history, social studies, geography, history, world history. So it's important to think about these things, and you will have, again, this document. How the scriptural source came to be, both from the sacred history perspective and from scholarly perspectives. What is the nature of the scripture, its language, styles, and quote-unquote literary features such as narrative, use of imagery, but also what it contains in terms of commandments and prohibitions. Who interprets the text, and what expertise is required for legitimate interpretation? How the content of the scriptural source sheds light on the history and beliefs of adherents of the religions that affirm the scripture. In other words, the history of the stories being told. A discussion of how adherents differ in their interpretation and use of scripture, including sectarian differences. Natural opportunities for students to learn about the role of religion and scripture in the life of different societies. For example, many historical documents contain scriptural references. And of course may include some discussion of the scriptural sources for parts of legal systems. So with these guidelines in mind, and again this document will be available to you as well as the AAR and First Amendment Center guidelines, we will go forth and begin our learning process.
I would recommend that if anybody who's sitting in the back, because you were too polite to move around in front of Susan, feel free to come to the table and do that and get yourself comfortable before our next if you like to. Plenty of space. That is hard. Oh, yes.
But I mean, you don't think they hear
It's probably better, it's inconvenient or better. Because they'll never be done until the evaluations, so I couldn't hear her. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Maria Day-Cake. I teach in the Religious Studies Department at George Mason University, where I teach primarily Islamic studies. This is one of many presentations I've given to secondary school teachers, and every time I do, I'm sure that I'm going to see my son's teacher, who's a freshman in high school, in the audience somewhere, and I'll have the opportunity to apologize for what a difficult child he is, but it's not my fault, really. But anyway, I want to first of all just say that certainly as a parent, but also as someone who teaches at the university and therefore receives the students that you teach, that I'm very grateful for the work that you do, and any way that I can help, I'm happy to do that. All right, so I've been asked to give a kind of general introduction to the Quran and its role in Muslim life. And so what I've tried to do here is, I'm going to give just a tiny bit, a very quick bit of historical background, and then try to address some of the issues I know people, or questions people have about the Quran itself. Okay, so I guess if I hit, that works. Okay. I'm sure as teachers you all know that Islam emerges in the 7th century Near East. And it emerges with the Quran, right? The emergence of the Quran, or Islam as a religion, begins from the Muslim point of view with the revelation of the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad in what's usually estimated to be about the year 610. All right, in terms of the context, this is a map roughly of the 7th century Near East. And you can see that there's the two major empires, again, as I'm sure you know, were the Persian or Sassanid Empire, and also the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. And both of these empires, besides the stronghold they had on their major territories, also in many ways surrounded Arabia. So the influence of Byzantine Christianity stretched down the east coast of Africa, which is of course very close to southern Arabia. And then the same thing, the Persian Empire, although the official state religion was Zoroastrianism, had a very large number, maybe even a majority of Christians living in the empire. Again, very close to this tip right here in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. So Arabia was surrounded on all sides, in many ways, by these empires. And though it sometimes presented as kind of like a big hole that was isolated and alone, right, and all the civilization was taking place around it, it's true that things that we would normally associate with civilization, law and taxation and currency and literature, was not well developed in Arabia. People living in Arabia had constant contact with the people of those empires, and so it was familiar with the people of those empires, their cultures as well as their religions. But Arabia in the 7th century was primarily tribal. That is, it wasn't organized by class, it didn't have ruling or government structures, it was organized genealogically, right, by tribe, and then within that by clans and so on. Most of the population, if it wasn't fully nomadic, was semi-nomadic. So they would live part of the year maybe in one place and part of the year in the other as they looked for pasture land, let's say, for their grazing animals, which was the primary mode of subsistence in Arabia. There were very few places where you could actually do farming in Arabia. One of those few places is Medina, where some farming could be done. But otherwise, it was generally a nomadic or semi-nomadic population. There was no written culture. There was, at the time of the emergence of Islam, there already had been for maybe a century or two some rudimentary forms of Arabic writing. And we have rocks and stones and inscriptions that point to pre-Islamic Arabic writing that bears clear relation to the Arabic that we know today, but was not standardized across the peninsula, was, as I said, very rudimentary. So it was predominantly an oral culture, and cultural information, whether it would be family genealogies or histories or other kinds of things, would have been transmitted orally and often in poetic form, because of course poetry makes it easier to memorize and repeat and hand things down. So poetry was certainly the most important cultural medium, and it had already been taken to a quite high level from that point of view before the coming of Islam. And as I said, a lot of contact with these other empires. They knew about books and about writing and about other forms of cultural transmission, but they did not have the resources or the ability within Arabia to produce those themselves. All right, so the religious and cultural context, as I said, the major empires were predominantly Christian. So that would have been the one major religion that Arabs, even in the pre-Islamic period, would have encountered. There were also not only Christians in the empires, there were Christian tribes in Arabia, many of them located either in the south or the north, where they were in direct contact with the Byzantine Empire or parts of the Sasanian Empire. You also had Christian hermits that would sort of go off into the wilderness, and the wilderness was often Arabia, to live. So they were familiar, Arabs again, very familiar with Christianity. You also had Jewish tribes in Arabia. It's unclear if those Jewish tribes were converts, if they were sort of Arabs that had been converted to Judaism. There's a large Jewish presence in the southern part of Arabia and Yemen, really, until the 20th century. Or whether they were part of an original diaspora of Israelites somehow. It's unclear. We can't tell from their names. When you look at their names in the sources, sometimes they look like Arabized versions of Jewish names or Hebrew names, and sometimes they look like originally Arabic names. It's very hard to tell where they come from. Other religions in the area, of course, the state religion in the Sasanian Empire was Zoroastrianism, which was a kind of dualism in a sense. There was a god of goodness and light and a god of darkness and evil. But Zoroastrians believed that ultimately the god of goodness and light would overcome. And so Muslims eventually, when they got into Iran, into what was the Sasanian Empire very early in their history, determined that Zoroastrianism could be a protected religion because it was ultimately monotheistic. There's also elements of Manichaeism, which was a more rigidly dualist tradition in parts of Iraq and Iran, but that was not tolerated. Although, again, very small elements largely went underground after the coming of Islam to those regions. Now, in Arabia itself, I said there's a Jewish and Christian presence. Most of the population of Arabia, from what we know, which is relatively little, seems to have been pagan and polytheistic in one way or another. But they did have a knowledge of a kind of overarching creator god that they called Allah. So Allah is not a name for God that originates with Islam. It's already there in Arabia, certainly in the central parts of Arabia where Muhammad lives, prior to the coming of Islam. So Muhammad's father is Abdullah, which is the servant of Allah. So even before the revelation of the Quran, this name Allah is there, but they also worshipped other deities that they considered either intermediaries, perhaps, or deities that were unique to a particular tribe. It's hard to know. Again, most of the information we have about the pre-Islamic period comes from sources written by Muslims after. And so in many ways, they're kind of characterizing, or you might even say caricaturing, this earlier period. So we don't know exactly what it was like, but it was clearly polytheistic. Scattered, because it was a nomadic culture scattered throughout Arabia, you had various shrines that would also serve as sort of stopping points wherever you were on the way. And again, these shrines were multi-religious, right? Not only various tribes in Arabia, but we think maybe even Jews and Christians who lived in Arabia may have stopped as well at these shrines. And of course, the one we know famously today is the Kaaba in Mecca. So Mecca was one of these shrine cities. It was very important, therefore, was a stopping point. Every year it had an annual pilgrimage, even in pre-Islamic times. And of course, when Islam comes, the Kaaba is rededicated as a monotheistic shrine. The polytheistic elements are removed. Okay, so Muhammad is born in the city of Mecca. This is an artist's rendition of what Mecca may have looked like in Muhammad's time. You can see, I'm sorry, it's blurry, but you can see just the Kaaba in the center and just houses around, very simple, right? This is a picture of the Kaaba in the early 20th century. Still relatively modest. If you've seen pictures of Mecca today, it's quite a different scene. But Muhammad is born into this context. He's born into a tribe, the primary predominant tribe in Mecca, which is the Quraysh. And they are polytheistic. They're also practicing polytheism. Islamic tradition says that the Prophet Muhammad never engaged in this, that he was always a kind of primordial monotheist, someone who believed in the one God, that there was only one God, but was neither a Jew nor a Christian. Muhammad was orphaned at an early age. His father dies before he's born, and his mother dies while he's still a young child, somewhere between the ages of 2 and 6. He's widely reported to have been illiterate, unable to read or write. And so in many ways was not the kind of person in Arabia who one would expect to become a great leader. And in Arabia, if you wanted to become a great leader, You needed to have a powerful father. You needed to have lots of brothers. Right? It was a very male-centered culture. And Muhammad had no brothers. He had no father. He was orphaned. He was illiterate. And really, until the age of 40, he lives a fairly normal life. Nothing terribly extraordinary. He's whatever, seems to have been whatever would have been middle class in Mecca. He's a merchant. He's married. He has a nice married life, a few children. Nothing that would have pointed him out as extraordinary, except the reports that he would engage in a kind of personal monotheistic practice, not engaging in the polytheistic tradition of his people. Muhammad is said to have first started receiving the revelations in 610. That is when he's about 40 years old, which would be getting up there, I think, in Arabia at the time. So it's not an early part of his life. He first receives the revelation in a kind of shocking way. It's said that one of the things he did as a kind of individual monotheist is that he would regularly go out to the mountains that surround, low-lying mountains that surrounded Mecca. And he would go to some of the caves, you know, for a period of time and just pray and meditate or engage in some kind of individual religious practice. And on one of these occasions, when he was in a cave outside of Mecca, in the middle of the night, alone in the dark, it said that this being came to him. And it's not represented as a kind of beautiful, lovely, like angels come down on a silver cloud and they're singing, and no, it's a very sort of intense and frightening experience. So it's recounted in different ways, but generally whatever this being is, Muhammad can't see him, but he grabs him and shakes him and says to him, "Iqra," which means either read or recite, but read out loud or recite. Muhammad says, I don't know how to read, or I don't know what to read. Right? Again, this being shakes him and says, "Recite." And this happens 3 times, and then the first 5 verses of the Quran, which begin with this command, "Iqra," are revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. Again, giving a very general statement, not a lot of information, right? Read in the name of your Lord who created you, who taught men what they did not know. Read in the name of your Lord who is most generous, right? So it's identifying that whatever the being is identifying this as a message from what Muhammad would have known as the creator God, as Allah, but the name is not used. And again, very sparse information in this initial revelation. It takes Muhammad some time, I won't go into the whole story, to really feel confident that the revelations he's receiving, which in the first few years are kind of few and far between, are actually coming from God and not from some other kind of inspiration or from his own imagination. But when he becomes confident of that, certainly by 613, after about 3 years, he begins, at the urging of a Quranic revelation he receives, he begins his public preaching in Mecca. It's not that well received, especially by the leading and influential members of Mecca. And so he and those who choose to follow him face increasing persecution in Mecca. And while he's in Mecca, he's instructed not to resist in any way that persecution. In 622, he flees, he and his followers flee to Medina, which had originally been called Yathrib. So here's Mecca. Medina is just almost directly north of Mecca. And when Muhammad goes to Medina, Medina is a city that's split between an Arab pagan polytheistic population and a set of Jewish clans and Jewish tribes. All of the polytheistic Arab clans convert to Islam which is what was a condition of Muhammad going there, or part of the agreement that they made, whereas the Jewish clans continue to practice their Jewish religion. Okay, there's a lot more to that story, but in the interest of time, how does that affect the Quran? The Quran is typically divided into revelations that Muhammad received, because he receives these revelations piecemeal over time during his last 23 years of his life, between those that were revealed to him while he was in Mecca and those that were revealed to him when he was in Medina. And remember, there would have been different audiences, right? So in Mecca, he would have been addressing predominantly a polytheistic audience, and he would have been addressing a community that was a very fragile and persecuted and endangered community. When he goes to Medina, he's in a much more established position. So the Meccan revelations tend to be shorter. They tend to be more poetic. They have a tighter rhyme and rhythm scheme, generally speaking. Most of the Quranic apocalyptic texts that talk about the coming of the end of time, the end of the world, the final apocalypse, not just individual human death, but the end of the world itself, is found in these Meccan surahs. And that might be in part because the population he was addressing in Mecca did not believe that there was an end to the world, and did not believe in an afterlife. And so it was the apocalyptic verses that you find in the Meccan text really emphasize the idea that this world you're living in is temporary and you're eventually going to be called to account. It's really, the apocalyptic texts are really focused on the idea of the impermanence of the world and the eventuality, the inevitability of personal judgment. We also find in the Meccan revelations a little bit later, usually what scholars call mid-Meccan revelations, narratives about pre-Muhammadan prophets. And many of these pre-Muhammadan prophets are biblical figures, right? So Noah and Moses and Abraham and his descendants and Lot, David and Solomon and so forth. There are also Arab prophets that do not have a counterpart in biblical text, but the majority of them can have some biblical counterpart as well. So the Meccan period lasts from 610 to 622, and roughly 60% of the Quran was revealed in Mecca. The Medinan revelations come from the last 10 years of Muhammad's life. As I said, they represent about 40% of the Quran. You see some of these same themes. You also see references to biblical figures and stories about biblical figures in Medinan revelations. But you see some other ideas coming forth, a much more directly polemical and rhetorical engagement with Jews and Christians. And this is, again, a factor of audience, right? In Medina, Muhammad's audience doesn't just include Muslims, but it also includes Jewish tribes. So much of that polemical engagement is with the Jewish clans in Medina, who relations begin on a pretty good basis when Muhammad first gets there, and the relations deteriorate over that period of 10 years. And that is reflected in many ways in this kind of, these arguments that are put forth for Muhammad to use when he engages the Jews, in particular of Medina. The other sort of new thing you find in Medinan revelations is more law and social rules and social regulations. Right? There's no point in having laws and social regulations for a community that's a small kind of persecuted religious minority in Mecca. But when Muhammad comes to Medina, very quickly, he becomes also the political head of Medina, and so he can begin to implement these rules and regulations. Right? So almost all of the, what we might call law, with the exception of some dietary law, that you find in the Quran comes from Medinan verses rather than from Meccan verses. Are there any questions about the history, just really quickly before we get?
How certain are we that particular parts of the Quran are from either Mecca or Medina? Is there a question? And also within an individual surah, is it possible that some parts would be from Mecca and some from Medina?
Yes. So in terms of the first question, it's not completely certain. Muslims themselves kept a record and produced texts that would give the context for the revelation of particular verses. That was really important, actually, for Muslims, because many of the verses were being revealed to Muhammad as advice for questions that would come up either from his opponents or even from his own disciples. In many ways, understanding what the Quranic text meant depended on knowing what the context was. It's like you have the answer to a question, but you need the question, right? You need the situation it was addressing. So because of that, Muslims did tend to, at least orally, remember those contexts quite well, and eventually they did write them down quite early in the history of Islamic writing and book culture. But also, Western scholars have gone through and done a kind of literary analysis and found that, you know, what they have found through the literary analysis, doing kind of literary, sometimes very technical study of the structure of individual verses, the types of words that are used and so on, largely align with what Muslims say in terms of where the verses are placed temporally or chronologically. But yes, it is true that there are verses where you might, a Medinan verse where you might have some Meccan verses, or a Meccan verse where there might be some Medinan verses. There are cases like that, yes. Often they're debated. But the sources do acknowledge that, usually Islamic sources, commentary sources on the Quran. Okay, anything else? Yes.
Are they, I think you mentioned it, but are they actually grouped that way, or are they interdisciplinary?
No.
Are they're all...
Well, that's my next slide. Well, it's not my next slide. It's my second to next slide. Yeah, they're not in order. So in general, the Medinan surahs tend to be longer. The individual verses within the chapters tend to be longer. And then the chapters themselves tend to be longer, but not always. The Medinan surahs are grouped, and by surah I haven't really introduced this term, but I think you know what that means, the chapters of the Quran. They tend to be found more commonly at the beginning of the Quran, and the revelations that Muhammad received earliest in his career are at the end, but not always. So it's not a perfect chronological organization. It's not a perfect organization by length. It's a bit mixed, right? Okay. Other questions? All right. So what do Muslims believe about the Quran? First of all, it is, as I said, predominantly an oral revelation because it was given orally to the Prophet Muhammad through the angel Gabriel. The angel Gabriel, same angel Gabriel in the Jewish and Christian tradition. Is considered the angel of revelation in Islam, and he brings the revelations orally to the Prophet Muhammad. Prophet Muhammad would memorize them and transmit them to his followers who would also memorize them. So not only the reception of the Quran, but its initial transmission was predominantly oral. At a certain point, Muhammad began, probably in the late Meccan period, to employ scribes, people who did know how to read and write, who would take down some of the revelations as they were coming to him. Okay, but of course, Muhammad, being illiterate himself, couldn't check those, right? So again, the primary means for transmitting the text was oral. The word Quran itself means recitation, just like the word Bible means book. The Quran does sometimes refer to itself as a book, but the word Quran itself is recitation. And so that orality still exists at every level of Islamic tradition. I'll be talking more about that in the lecture in the afternoon. Muslims believe that the Quran is not the only revelation that came from God, but that, in fact, the one God revealed or sent messengers with messages or revelations to all peoples. But the Quran specifically mentions only some religions, and it specifically mentions only two scriptures, 3 if you include the Psalms, which it sometimes also mentions as a separate scripture. But it presents itself, in fact, explicitly refers to itself as a revelation in Arabic that confirms the previous revelations. It uses this term confirm, or confirmer, musaddiq, which means literally to attest to the truth of something. Okay. So it views the Torah and the Gospels as also revelations from God. At the same time, the Quran indicates that the Torah and the Gospels, even at the time of its own revelation, were not in their original form. So they're no longer perfect, they're no longer exactly as they were revealed, but it does refer to them as texts in which there is guidance and light. Right? So, and certainly as divinely revealed texts. The Quran views itself and refers to itself and suggests that it is the last and therefore the most perfect, or the revelation that is the most impervious, in fact totally impervious from an Islamic point of view, to human tampering or corruption. It's understood to be the last because Muhammad is understood to be the last prophet. He's described in the Quran as the seal of prophets, Khatam al-Anbiya, which means that there won't be any prophet to come and correct any problems that might arise in the text. So the text itself, therefore, is, they're kind of out of, should have had the next one, is considered to be guarded by God himself, right? To have a kind of divine protection, to therefore be unalterable. The Quran, as you'll see when you go to the exhibit, is considered to have been, as sort of the really miraculous part of the Quran, is that its style, its beauty, its language, the rhetorical force of its statements was said to be something that no human being could imitate, either in the beauty or in the power. And there are lots of traditions about how even Muhammad's enemies, who had an appreciation, of course, for Arabic poetry, because this was a high art form in Arabia, when Muhammad would recite the verses of the Quran, they would put their fingers in their ear, like, it's too good, if I listen to it, it's going to affect me, right? So these kinds of stories come down to us, and certainly the Quran's language, you can hear it even if you don't know Arabic, is very beautiful. About 80% of it rhymes, it has a clear rhythm, and it has many elements that we would consider to be poetic. The Quranic verses are therefore considered to be Muhammad's primary miracle. So in the Quran, when it tells stories about earlier prophets like Jesus and Moses, it talks about the extraordinary miracles they perform. It talks about Jesus raising the dead and healing the sick, and Moses parting the sea and so on. But Muhammad doesn't have miracles like that. Muhammad's primary miracle is the Quran itself. And the word in Arabic for verse of the Quran is ayah. And ayah literally means sign. And it's used in multiple ways in the text of the Quran itself, but one of the ways it's used is to mean miracle. Right? So the very verses of the Quran are considered to be miraculous. Okay. And here's something else. I know that there's a lot of questions about this. For Muslims, only the Quran in Arabic is the Quran. Anything else is an interpretation of the Quran, right? There's no, there are certain translations. Of course, the Quran's been translated into practically every major language on the planet. And very early on as well, there were Persian translations and so forth. But it is still an interpretation. Certain translations may gain a kind of authority or a stamp of kind of widespread approval, but no translation can be described as the Quran. Right? Only the Quran in Arabic is the Quran. Right? Which some people will say, does that mean you're not allowed to translate the Quran? Well, no. As you'll see, you can see in some of the manuscripts that are on display in the exhibit, they have sort of translations written right underneath, either in Ottoman Turkish or in Persian, right in the text of the Quran itself. But that's not the Quran. Okay? For this reason, when Muslims recite the Quran, even if they don't know Arabic, and it's only 20 to 25% of the worldwide Muslim population is a native speaker of Arabic, but all Muslims, no matter where they are, no matter what their language is, must recite the Quran in Arabic in their prayers. Right? And in any kind of liturgical function, it will be done in Arabic. Right? So even if you don't know Arabic, all really observant Muslims, pious Muslims, will have their children learn how to phonetically read the Arabic of the Quran. I always say it's the only easy thing about Arabic is that it's phonetic. Other than that, it's terribly difficult. All right. The organization of the Quran, as I said, there's the term surah is used for the individual chapters. There are 114 surahs in the Quran, and they range widely in size. So the largest one, Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the second surah of the Quran, has 286 verses. And many of those verses are quite long. They take up maybe half a page often in a traditional copy of the Quran. The shortest have 3 verses that again are also very short. So they range widely in size. There's over 6,200 verses or ayahs in the Quran. And as I said, this word ayah has a special significance. So this isn't just the word for verse. Like if you were talking about just ordinary kind of secular Arab poetry, you wouldn't use the word ayah to mean a verse of that poem. You would use bait. There's another term for that. So ayah only means verse in the context of the Quran. As I said, I already talked about that Meccan and Medina verses. As I said earlier, revelations tend to be at the end, and the things that Muhammad received at the end of his life tend to be at the beginning. I sometimes tell people, if you want to read the Quran, of course, everyone like sort of picks up the Quran and they start like page 1, because that's what we do, right? We take a book and we start at page 1. I sometimes say it might be good to read the Quran backwards. And I do this in my classes, in my course on the Quran. I start with these early Meccan revelations first, right? Not only because they are the first verses revealed to Muhammad, but they also tend to be the first verses Muslims learn. So when children are taught the Quran, they don't start with Surah Al-Baqarah and teach them the whole, these very long surahs. They begin often with the short surahs at the end because they rhyme. Not only are they shorter, but they rhyme and they have rhythm, so they're easier to memorize for children. As I said this before, so the Quran is not arranged in the chronological order of its revelation. Okay. Not in any kind of direct way. It's also not a narrative text. So even when it tells stories, for example, of Moses, it doesn't tell the story of Moses as a continuous narrative in order. If you read from the beginning of the text, the first time he would meet Moses, he would be wandering with his people after having already been liberated from Egypt. And you have to get much further into the central part of the text, Surah 20 or Surah 26, to get to the story of him as a child being put in the basket and sent down the river by his mother. So some of the unique features of the Quran as a scripture, there is no history of Muhammad's life in the Quran. Muhammad by name, by the name Muhammad, is mentioned only 4 times in the Quran, but the entire Quran addresses him, really. It's all addressed to him. So he's there, but not as a kind of third person. It's not a third-person narrative about the Prophet Muhammad, nor does it contain a story of the founding of the early Islamic community. So the Quran is being revealed to Muhammad in context, right, as this community is being formed. So obviously there wouldn't be a story of the life of the Prophet Muhammad or a story of the life of the founding community. If you want to know the story of Muhammad or the story of the founding of the Muslim community, you have to turn to other sources. Right? There are biographies of Muhammad, there are histories about the early period of Islam, but you won't find that in the Quran, which is very different from the biblical text. Right? The biblical text contains actually biographical narratives of figures, important figures, as well as history. Because the Quran is spoken to the Prophet Muhammad, it often takes the form of very direct address, which is sometimes startling to people. It can make it seem, even for people reading it in English or in some kind of translation, as if the text is jumping off the page at them, right? As if it's addressing the reader itself. So there are many passages that are directly addressed to Muhammad. They begin with the imperative verb say, qul, which is it's sort of directing Muhammad to say something to either his followers, in some cases to his opponents or his detractors, or so on. Sometimes it addresses particular people. So it might address the children of Israel. It might address the people of the book, by which it means Jews and Christians. It might address specifically the believers, the mu'minun, which it usually is understood to mean specifically the Muslim community. Sometimes it addresses all of mankind. Right? So it often begins, many of the verses begin with this kind of direct address. It has a very singular and recognizable style. Some of you know that Muslims also, another source of religious guidance for Muslims is the Hadith, which are collections of accounts of things that Muhammad either said or did. But anyone who reads the two will see that there is a very clear stylistic difference. It's very hard to mistake the Quran and the Hadith, right? The style is very distinctive. And although it changes slightly, as I said, the earlier surahs tend to be slightly more poetic and shorter, and the ones in Medina tend to be a little bit longer. The overall style is consistent. And we have today some scholars who've actually applied very technical stylometric sort of techniques to the Quran itself, and found in a kind of quantitative statistical way that I don't understand, that in fact it is, I don't know how I did that, I did something here, that it is in fact a consistent style all the way through. Something else is a self-referencing text, that is, it refers to itself, I already said, as a Quran, as a recitation, also refers to itself as a book. It refers to itself as a reminder, as a dhikr, for all the worlds, right? Presenting itself as a universal message. It is poetic in style. It has everything that we might be taught poetry has. I mentioned rhyme and rhythm. About 80% or so of the Quran rhymes. But it also has imagery and simile and metaphor and alliteration, and all those things that would constitute poetry. But Muslims will say very clearly it is not poetry. In part to distinguish it from the tradition of Arab poetry, of secular Arab poetry that already existed there. But also because one of the things that Muhammad's detractors would use to dismiss him is to say, oh, he's just a poet. Just a poet. And so the Quran says, no, Muhammad is not a poet, right? He's not a poet. These are divine revelations. So even though it's poetic, Muslims would not call it poetry as such. The other sometimes startling thing about the Quran is that God is referenced sometimes directly in the first person, right? Either as I or we, speaking directly to the reader, to the audience, to the hearer. And the first person plural is very frequently used, we. Right? And it's the royal we. It's not like God and lots of other people, but the royal we is being used there. And sometimes I, right? Sometimes the first person. Also the second person, there are parts of the Quran that function as prayers. A very good example is the very first surah of the Quran. And God there can be addressed as you, right? In the second person, you're praying to God. but also in the third person. And God is also referred to by the third person pronoun. It's a masculine pronoun, he, but only because of the limits of Arabic language. It's understood that God is not male or female. And in addition to the name Allah, there are also other names and qualities or attributes that take the form of qualities and attributes of God. Typically lists of 99 were made. So the most common of those would be Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, the compassionate or the merciful, names that are invoked in almost every chapter or surah of the Quran, but also other names, the all-knowing, the holy, the all-powerful, even the friend, the protector, right? So many, many names. The other important thing, and I think it makes both the Quran and its Islamic context unique, is that the Quran is a scripture that has a specific sacred language. As I said, only in Arabic is it the Quran, but it has a universal claim. Most scriptures that have a specific sacred language, like Hebrew for the Torah, right, or Sanskrit for important Hindu texts, also conceive of themselves as religions for a specific group of people, right? Hinduism is sort of the religion for the people of India. And Judaism, at least originally, was the religion for the people who were Hebrews. But the Quran has both a specific sacred language, but it also has a universal claim. It's a message for everyone, the Quran said. Right? And that makes it fairly unique, and of course has meant that Arabic has spread, at least to some extent, all over the globe as Islam has spread. Okay. In Muslim life, just checking my time. Okay.
6 minutes.
6 minutes? Okay. So the Quran is something that is a complete part of the life of any observant Muslim. The 5 prayers that Muslims pray throughout the day, the primary text of those prayers are verses from the Quran itself, right? So the Fatiha, the opening chapter or surah of the Quran is repeated in every single one of those prayers, along with other passages of the Quran, right? So any practicing Muslim has to know at least some of the Quran in Arabic by heart. Muslims will often inflect their language, their speech, I should say, not their language, with pious formulas, right? Inshallah, if God wills. They talk about something in the future, they say inshallah, or mashallah, or alhamdulillah, which means praise or thanks be to God. Right? When someone dies, they say, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, verily we belong to God and to Him we return. All of these sort of formulas that are so important in Muslim life come directly from the Quran itself. Right? So again, the Quran would permeate, in that sense, orally a Muslim's life. Muslims also regularly recite the Quran or read the Quran out loud or even to themselves outside of prayer. During Ramadan especially, but not just, Muslims will often try to read through the entire Quran during the month of Ramadan. Memorizing the Quran, not just part of it, but all of it, is still something that many Muslims spend and devote years of their life to doing, both male and female. Okay, so a person who's memorized the whole Quran is called a hafiz, which means literally a preserver. And this relates to the idea that the Quran is ultimately preserved in people's memories, in their hearts, not in any particular text. And children's is an example of children studying the Quran. So children would be taught certainly to read phonetically the Quran and also to memorize significant parts of it as children. And so this would be something that would be part of their life in every way. Very briefly, people ask me, what's in the Quran? Okay, so very briefly, what's in the Quran? It certainly talks about God. It has theological content. It tells us something about the Islamic view of God, of the divine nature, how God relates to human beings. I said it also mentions his 99 names, which are various names which are qualities of God. It talks a lot about human nature and human psychology and moral psychology. Right? It talks about the sort of flaws that human beings are always given to: forgetfulness, ingratitude, overconfidence in their own ability, hard-heartedness, and miserliness. Right? And it talks about the ways to overcome those kinds of issues. It mentions creatures other than human beings as those who have a relationship with their Creator. It talks about angels, not a surprise, I think, in general. It talks about jinn, which are considered to be sort of psychic beings that, like human beings, are subject to moral trial and also receive revelation and also can be good or bad. But it also talks about nature and other creatures, animals, but even inanimate aspects of nature, the celestial bodies or the mountains, as beings that have a relationship with their Creator. Places where they actually have a kind of brief dialogue. They're addressed by God, or they return that address. As I said, there's a great deal of sacred history, but most of it pre-Mohammedan. So stories of early prophets: Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael. Both Isaac and Ishmael are considered prophets in Islam. David and Solomon, Job, Jonah, Moses, and Aaron. And if you look at these names, not only will you recognize them from the biblical text, but you would also note that all of these figures are considered prophets by Muslims, but they're not all considered prophets by Jews and Christians. So Adam's not usually referred to as a prophet. Even Abraham as a forefather, 2-minute warning, is typically, the term prophet is not usually assigned to him. Moses, surely, but not Aaron, not Job, not Jonah. So prophecy is a much bigger category in Islam than it is in the Jewish or Christian tradition. Of course, it also mentions Jesus, who Christians don't consider a prophet either, but it mentions Jesus, it mentions Mary, John the Baptist, and his father Zechariah are also mentioned from the New Testament section of the Bible, as well as some Arab prophets. Eschatology is a theme that runs throughout the Quran, from the Meccan to the Medinan verses. And as I said, in the Meccan verses, it includes a lot of apocalyptic texts about the end of the world. But all throughout the Quran, it talks about what happens after you die. It talks about accountability, that when you die, you're going to be resurrected. You're going to be judged. You're going to be judged as an individual. You can't blame anybody else. Not your mother, not your father, thank God, not your teachers or your community. You are individually, morally accountable before God at that moment. And then it gives very elaborate, some people would say graphic descriptions, sensual descriptions, using sensory images of both paradise and what it calls the fire or hell. Okay? And those images would not be tremendously startling or seem terribly different from general Christian conceptions of, let's say, heaven and hell, but they're just found throughout very directly, very explicitly in the Quranic text as a warning. And finally, law and ritual and ethics are found, particularly law and ritual, particularly in the Medinan surahs, and ethics throughout. Right? So many people think of the Quran as a book of law. It's not really predominantly a book of law. A relatively small proportion of its verses, depending on how you count, between about 200 and 400 of the overall 6,200 plus verses, deal with specific rulings or specific laws. Okay? In terms of ritual, all the major rituals of a Muslim's life are mentioned in the Quran, but not always in great detail. So the encouragement to pray, even to pray at specific times of the day, is mentioned, but not with full detail. You wouldn't know as a Muslim, if you just picked up the Quran and you had no other training, you wouldn't know exactly when you were supposed to pray. You wouldn't know exactly how. You wouldn't know how you were supposed to pray. All of that comes from the remembered practice of Muhammad and the early community, not from the Quran itself. And ethics, of course, runs throughout the Quran. And the Quran is a continuous encouragement to the cultivation of virtuous characteristics, right? Charity and justice, patience, compassion, forgiveness, right? These are constantly emphasized in the Quran, even outside of specific legal contexts. All right, so Susan says I'm out of time.
Show us the last slide.
The last slide. Yes, I could talk about this also a little bit in the afternoon, but quickly, because of the sacredness of the Quran, even though it's really only the Quran in Arabic, and although it's really predominantly an oral translation or oral revelation, when the Quran does get put down in writing, because, especially if it's in Arabic, it's considered sacred. Okay? And so there are rules for the handling of the Arabic Quran, right? Generally, you should be in a state of ablution or purity. People who are in a kind of state of ritual impurity should not touch the Quran. The Quran would never, a Muslim would never put the Quran on the floor, would never ear the pages, would never take a yellow highlighter, right? Would not treat it like an ordinary text. And so this right here is a rahab. It's called, and it is a stand for reading the Quran, right? Because again, Muslims might sit on the floor and read the Quran. We want to put the Quran on the floor. So you put the Quran on this stand, and there's, I think, some nice examples of that in the exhibit as well. And I can talk a little more, again, in the a little bit later in the second talk, but the Quranic inscriptions, or put on jewelry that people would wear. Sometimes they would be understood as talismans or amulets of protection. But they also become the basis, the Quran becomes the basis of all of the major Islamic arts. Not only recitation, which I think we're going to hear very soon, but also calligraphy. Right? The whole development of Arabic as a written language, both in terms of its grammar and its structure and that kind of thing, but also in terms of its orthography, the way, the beautiful way in which it's written, all inspired by the Quran. And of course, it becomes also part of architectural and artistic adornment. Mosques and other public buildings and structures would have the Quran inscribed on it, as well as articles for daily use, plates and vases and things like that as well. Okay, so I will stop there. And I will be around, so if you have questions, you can ask me then. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. I neglected, because I was getting her a cup of water and we were plugging things in, I actually neglected to introduce her formally. You by now know that she is Maria Daycake, and I particularly want to let you know that her qualifications are basically unbelievable. In addition to researching, publishing on Islamic intellectual history, Quranic studies, Shia and Sufi traditions, and women's spirituality and religious experience, she has just completed work on a major collaborative project to produce the first HarperCollins Study Quran, which comprises a verse-by-verse commentary on the Quranic text. This work draws upon classical and modern Quran commentaries, making the rich and varied tradition of Muslim commentary on their own scripture, written almost exclusively in Arabic and Persian, accessible to an English-speaking audience for the very first time in such a comprehensive manner. I cannot underestimate the significance of having the study Quran. It's quite available now to, I'm working my way through it. I'm maybe an eighth of the way through, having gotten it myself. She's also currently working with Daniel Madigan on a co-edited volume, The Routledge Companion to the Quran, and working independently on a monograph on the concept of religion as a universal phenomenon in the Quran and Islamic intellectual studies. And she's been kind enough to come today to give us 2 lectures, and so you will have another chance to listen to her with that information in mind.